John F. Kennedy. The youngest president ever elected was a man of the American people who fought for their ideals. In 1961, he became president and announced that NASA would send a man to the moon by the end of the decade. He stopped a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, met an untimely death in 1963. When John Fitzgerald Kennedy, otherwise known as JFK, was born on May 29, 1917, nobody expected him to be a future U.S. president. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, a town about 5 miles away from Boston. He caught the scarlet fever when he was only 2 years old and was hospitalized for over 2 months. When he was 10 years old, he moved to Riverdale, New York. Soon after they moved, the stock market collapsed. When he was 14, he enrolled at Choate, an elite boarding school in Connecticut. In June 1935, he graduated from Choate High School. In the fall of 1935, he enrolled at Princeton, but was forced to drop out 2 months later due to illness. About a year later, he enrolled to Harvard and went there for 4 years, until he graduated in 1939 with a Bachelor in International Affairs. In September 1941, he wanted to join the Navy, but his health conditions were not good enough to pass the tests. He found a loophole, though. His dad helped get him a fake health document, and soon enough, he was in the Navy. In 1942 to 1943, he commanded a PT-109 torpedo boat. On August 2, 1943, his ship was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. He saved nearly all of his crew and received a Purple Heart for his heroics. On August 12, 1944, John's brother died while piloting a plane for a secret World War II mission. On March 1st, he was discharged from the Navy. The start of his political career. In June of 1946, he started his political career by winning the Democratic primary for the 11th Congressional District. 5 months later, he was officially elected into the House. In 1948, he was elected for a second term. On a trip to England that summer, he was diagnosed with Addison's disease. However, he didn't tell the public until later. In 1952, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. In 1956, JFK was convinced by Estes Coffever to become Adlai Stevenson's running mate. However, Stevenson was blown out by Dwight Eisenhower for his re-election. In 1957, his first child, Caroline, was born. In July 1960, he won the Democratic nomination for president. 3 months later, Kennedy beat Richard Nixon in a close race for president. On January 20th, 1961, Kennedy was sworn in as President of the USA.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 16, 1962, some U.S. U-2 fighter planes were flying over Cuba and captured high-altitude pictures of Soviet soldiers hurriedly setting up nuclear missiles. For a while before this, the U.S. knew that the Soviets had been sending defensive weapons to Cuba, including anti-aircraft missiles. But Kennedy told Cuban officials that if the Soviets ever introduced any offensive weapons, that the gravest issues would arise. JFK didn't want the Soviets to know that he discovered the missiles, so he met with his advisors for several days to discuss the issue. The United States at the time had more than 25,000 nuclear weapons in their arsenal. The Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not even half of that. In 1960, Dwight Eisenhower said that if a crisis led either side to fire nuclear weapons, everyone in the northern hemisphere would die. After many meetings with advisors, he sent a naval blockade around Cuba, a quarantine as he called it, to prevent the Soviets from bringing more military supplies into Cuba. 13 days later, they established a deal that would make sure that the Soviets dismantled the missiles in Cuba, and in return, the US promised not to invade Cuba. In a separate deal that was kept secret for over 25 years, the US also promised to take its nuclear missiles out of Turkey. Even though the Soviet Union took its nuclear missiles out of Cuba, they continued to build up their weapons arsenal. Even though the missile crisis was over, the arms race was far from done. In the days leading up to his death, JFK was starting an early campaign tour for the 1964 election. On his final trip, he was supposed to visit 5 cities in Texas, including San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and Austin. He didn't make it to Austin. On the sunny, warm Friday in Dallas, the president, his wife, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife were riding in a blue Lincoln Continental convertible. Little did they know that Kennedy's killer, Harvey Lee Oswald, would be sitting atop the 6th floor of the Texas School Depository. Oswald, armed with a Carcano infantry rifle, sitting atop book boxes. At 12:28, the presidential motorcade approached Dealey Plaza. Once they got there, they turned north, which happened to be a left turn, and that put the Texas School Book Depository right behind the presidential limo. At 12:30, shots were fired from the building. Witnesses say there was as many as 8 shots fired. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who was riding in the car right behind Kennedy, said that he heard the first shot ring out, and then he sprinted towards the presidential limo to shield the president from any other bullet. After that, a second shot rang out, piercing JFK right in the skull. Governor Connally screamed in horror, "I have his brains on my hands." The presidential limo started speeding up to race to Parkland Hospital, passing their intended destination of the Dallas Trade Mart on the way. By the time they got there, it was obvious that there was no chance of Kennedy living, but nonetheless, they did everything they could to try to keep him alive. At 1 p.m., Kennedy was pronounced dead after all brain activity ceased and Catholic priest Father Oscar Huber gave him the last rites. At 1:33, his death was publicly announced and left the country and world in shock. Meanwhile, Oswald was fleeing the scene when he was questioned by 39-year-old officer J.D. Tippit, who asked what he was doing. In panic, he fired 1 shot and killed Tippit. In the days following Kennedy's assassination, everyone was furious at his killer, none more than Jack Ruby. On November 24th, Dallas police were transferring Oswald, with crowds including news reporters and journalists among other people. Ruby was hiding among the crowd and burst out and fired 1 shot and killed Oswald. Due to Ruby, no one was ever able to truly question Oswald to figure out his motives.
Okay, so when JFK was shot, I remember exactly where I was. I was in my science classroom in junior high, and our principal came in and just told us what had happened, that he had been shot, and then later we found out that he had died. Okay, so I also especially remember the day of his funeral, and of course we had seen on the news all the videos and that the reporters had taken of the actual assassination and the horror of it. It was just, a beautiful day. They were riding in an open car and they were waving to the crowd, and then all of a sudden you would see all the action that was happening, and they did report very openly, just showed all the pictures of his actual assassination and Jackie sitting next to him. And then I remember the funeral because it was just like, I think everybody that was alive at that time, that's all we were doing on that day of his funeral. And we just watched all day the procession, the preparation for it, and the procession. I remember like a chant sort of that they were playing as they were marching through, going down through the streets, and so just kind of have that in the back of my mind too, the cadence of that chant, of the music and the rhythm of the drums and everything. So it was just kind of a once in a lifetime memory, like that the president of the United States was shot, and he was such a hopeful person. Like everyone just looked up to him because of his leadership and his vision for our country. And he was so young, and we grew up watching his children, in the White House, and just they were a beautiful family. And so it was just such a sad experience and horrifying to see that could happen to someone in the presidency. So it was a time that I do remember. So those are some things that I remember about the day of the funeral.